Following speaker is a well-known writer, Siri Hustvedt. She's very famous in Paris, where I'm from, and I knew her books while I was in Paris. She has written 4 novels. All of them have been translated. 2 books of essay, one of which is essays on art criticism. And there is particularly one essay I love. Well, all of them are really interesting, bringing new things into art history. I remember something about Goya, about the Tres de Mayo, for instance. But I was particularly sensitive to a review of the last Morandi show that was very important for Morandi. It was in Venice in 1998. And the title was Not Just Bottles. Siri Hustvedt has a PhD in literature. She's written, as I told you, 4 novels. Her last one is The Sorrows of an American. It's been published in April in New York, but also in April in Paris, where I found the book. And the title in French is Élégie pour un Américain, Elegy for an American, which is misunderstanding of the title, of the original title. I don't know if you were aware about that, but it reminded me a beautiful quote of Roberto Longhi, one of the best art historians of the 20th century, a great friend of Morandi. 9 of his paintings are now in the show, and he used to define the painting of Morandi as a severe, luminous elegy. So maybe it's a misunderstanding, but it's also bringing something new, as you will do, Siri. Thank you.
I think this is the first time I've been able to do this. Look, it grows. This is great. I am technology free today, and the reason is because actually following some of our other speakers, I think that memory, holding the show in your mind and holding some of the slides you've seen in your mind will be just as good as looking at particular images for this little talk. I also wanted to say this strange thing that my husband came home yesterday. He had been traveling, and he said he had read this horrible review of the Morandi show in the Financial Times, saying that this person simply didn't understand anything. You know, it was all the same. And all I can say is I think she just wasn't giving these images enough time. I, too, am going to go back to this rather mysterious thing that Morandi said in an interview with Edouard Roditi in 1960. It was quoted before. This is the English translation, of course, but I'm going to say it again. Morandi said, "I believe that nothing is more abstract, more unreal than what we actually see. We know all that we can see of the objective world as human beings never really exists as we see and understand it. Matter exists, of course, but has no intrinsic meaning of its own, such as the meanings that we attach to it. Only we know a cup is a cup, that a tree is a tree." This is a restatement of a similar comment he made in 1957 in a radio interview. Quote again, "For me, nothing is abstract. In fact, I believe there is nothing more surreal, nothing more abstract than reality." This slightly earlier and more cryptic comment has been quoted by many writers on Morandi, including me, in an essay I wrote of late Morandi paintings at the Peggy Guggenheim Museum in Venice. The comment has attracted many critics because they seem to reveal something important about the painter's aesthetic position. The question is, what did Morandi mean? Images are not words, and artists are not always able to articulate what they do or even what they hope to do. Nevertheless, we know that Morandi carefully revised the interview he did with Roditi. Presumably then, he said exactly what he wished to say, no more, no less. Reading the interview was a somewhat comic experience for me. While Roditi is positively garrulous, meandering in and out of various subjects and bringing up one artist after another, Morandi is terse and often contrarian. He will be led nowhere he doesn't want to go. I believe that nothing is more abstract, more unreal than what we actually see. This is plainly a philosophical statement. We can take it back to Immanuel Kant, who argued that we, human beings, will never get to the thing itself. Seeing is not seeing the real world, but seeing the world through our perceptions of it, perceptions steeped in our meanings, and, as Morandi explicates in his philosophy, those meanings are at least in part produced by language. We agree to call that thing a cup and that other thing a tree. How does Morandi use the word abstract, however? My Webster's gives several meanings. 1a, considered apart from any application to a particular object as abstract truth. B, ideal, abstruse. 2, of words, names, etc., not concrete. 3, dealing with the subject in its theoretical considerations only. And 4, art, presenting or characterized by non-representational designs depicting no recognizable thing. My sense is that Morandi is saying that beneath our myriad experiences of the world, under our perceptual images, our language and emotions, is something out there, matter, which is like abstraction in art, a fundamentally unrecognizable reality, which is unavailable to us. One may ask, should any of this concern us when we look at a Morandi painting? Do we really care about his abstract reality? I think we do. And yet, it's important to ground that caring in some sense of what happens when we see a work of art. A painting is there to be seen. It has no other purpose. And we can only see it in the first person. There is no third-person view, no objective he hovering above the image, looking at it. That first-person experience is an embodied one. I don't only bring my eyes or my intellectual faculties or my emotions to a picture. I bring my whole self with its whole story. The relation then is between an I and an it, but that it partakes of the artist's being as well, his entire being, which is why we treat art in a different way from utilitarian objects like forks, no matter how attractive those forks may be. My position is a phenomenological one. Looking at art can't be separated from our lived experience of the world, and the image exists in my perception of it. In his essay, I and Mind, the philosopher Merleau-Ponty quotes Cézanne, "Nature is inside us," and then goes on to say, this is a quote, "Quality, light, color, depth, which are there before us, are there only because they awaken and echo in our body, and the body welcomes them. This is the pleasure of art, and doodling elephants and monkeys aside, it is a uniquely human one. A painting can represent or not represent something in the world, but it is always generated out of the artist's experience of the visible. Morandi's work hovers at the threshold between what I recognize, say, as a representation of a cup and a quality of alienation in that cup that has lost the illusion of solidity and realness that I may find in Chardin, for example. Morandi loves Chardin, and what the artists share, beside the still life genre, is that both of them enchanted their objects, but in different ways. The magic of Chardin is that the coffee pot and the garlic do appear to be representations of these ordinary things, and yet, as you look at them, they become emotionally charged to a degree that seems almost supernatural. I attribute this to the gestures in his canvases, which are communicated to the viewer as visible touch. In fact, looking at the best of Chardin's pictures is almost like being caressed. The artist affects us at a deep and wordless level of human experience that goes back to infancy, being held and touched. Paradoxically, this feeling is more potent in Chardin's still lifes than in his images of figures, where the illusion is that we are looking at living, breathing people. Morandi, too, understood that painting the inanimate had extraordinary possibilities because the very humility of the things represented allowed greater room for the artist's expressiveness. But the spell Morandi casts over his objects is different. His bottles, cups, cloths, balls, and various other things he collected and allowed to get dusty and set up before him to paint were not chosen because they are objects of daily human life. Looking at a Chardin still life of a sausage, knife, and bread, for example, I am drawn to the fact that here is food and a utensil, something we human beings use daily. I could have left those same objects out in my kitchen. They summon the absence of the person who cut and ate the sausage and bread. In Chardin's still life, there are human beings just outside the frame. Morandi's groupings of objects do not resemble everyday kitchen scenes. The things he chose are solely for his perception. That is their only utility. In Chardin, I know that a glass of water is for drinking, the garlic for food preparation. In Morandi, a cup is to be seen. I can say, that's a cup, or that's a representation of a cup, but I feel a certain uneasiness when I name it. The cup has somehow been denatured of its cupness. Not entirely, but partly. Only we know that a cup is a cup, a tree is a tree. Language is, of course, far more than naming. It is a symbolic, intersubjective, self-referential system of signs we use to structure a meaningful existence among ourselves. You will suspect I'm hallucinating if I tell you there's a frog on the podium and you don't see one, but not if I point to the podium and say podium, because we are sharing the object in our visual field and both speak English. Language is also internal. We use it to carry on our running monologues or private inner dialogues as we go about our lives. In Morandi's work, I feel a desire, at least partially, to unhinge the thing from its name, a desire that is closely related to Cézanne. Cézanne wanted to strip perception of conventional expectations to see anew. Expectation, in its broadest sense, is vital to perceive anything. We see what we expect to see. which is shaped in part by our memories of having seen things before and in part by our brain's innate neural wiring for vision. But we also see what we pay attention to, and we cannot pay attention to everything in an image at once. Anne Treisman, a scientist studying perception, has proposed a sequence for visual perception. A pre-attentive process. We are quickly able to scan a scene when elementary properties such as color, brightness, or an orientation of lines are present that make it possible for us to distinguish figure from ground. This cursory first look, if you will, has an obvious evolutionary value. If your eyes can quickly detect that the tiger is separate from the woods behind him, you are less likely to be eaten. This first process encodes qualities such as color, orientation, size, and motion, and is then followed by an attentive process, which proceeds serially and more slowly. An example from the textbook, Principles of Neuroscience, helps illustrate this. If I show you a picture made up entirely of blue T's, interrupted by a single red T, and ask you to identify the unique element, the red T will pop out instantly. On the other hand, if I show you a painting of blue T's and L's, red L's, and a single red T, the lone red T will not be apparent to you without a bit of searching. It requires a higher level of cognition to distinguish it. You have to shift your attention from one letter to the next to discover the lone red T. Visual perception is not fully understood. For example, it is known that the many visual areas of the brain specialize in certain kinds of recognition: color, form, movement, even face recognition. But how these various areas or neural pathways in the brain come together to create a coherent image isn't understood and is often called the binding problem. What is known is that human beings are not passive receptors of the out there. Our embodied minds are actively both creating and interpreting what we see. This corresponds to a Mirandian vision. We know that all we can see of the objective world as human beings never really exists as we see and understand it. It is also not known how we become conscious of something out there in the world. There is unconscious vision, subliminal information that never reaches consciousness because it is seen too briefly, for example. But even an unconsciously registered image can affect us emotionally. The role language plays in consciousness is hotly debated, but it is safe to say that I cannot speak about something I am not conscious of. Although, as Freud has shown, something may pop out of my mouth inadvertently into the light of day, a slip of the tongue that tells you what's going on below the surface. Nevertheless, I cannot identify a cup as such in a painting without a self-reflective awareness of that object. Morandi, it seems to me, actively investigates the drama of perception, and he plays with both levels of vision, the pre-attentive and the attentive. He once said, quote, "The only interest the visible world awakens in me concerns space, light, color, and forms. These are what might be called the essentials of vision." But note that he does not mention content. The cups and trees he brought up with Roditi, which plainly stand in for his two painterly genres, Still life and landscape are not mentioned. This is because the linguistic identities of the collective things, or the houses and gardens and the natural scenes, don't truly matter. It would be preposterous to say that Morandi didn't know he was painting bottles, jars, cups, houses, and trees, or that they weren't intimate to him. He meditated on his still life objects for years, made a world of them, shifted them around, put them in various lights, and painted them again and again. But if you have ever looked long enough at a thing, you will notice that one of the first aspects to vanish is the word for it. Other qualities come to the fore. I did a test with a Perrier bottle sitting on my desk. First, I noticed its green color, the shape of its body and neck standing out against the clutter of my desk. Then I looked for a while at the vague print of its label on the other side. Then the light from my window illuminating its round side suddenly became a form in itself, as did a single ragged spot of light at the object's base. The more I looked, the more I saw. I noticed tiny drops of water inside the round exterior and their pattern, the distorted line of my bookshelf seen through the glass as another shape with another color, a pale green. My attention transformed it, and that was 5 minutes. Imagine looking at it and some carefully selected cousin objects for years, and then painting or drawing them. Even my brief experiment makes it clear that while looking attentively, I focused successively on the various characteristics of the bottle. My visual experience was one of roaming, if you will, moving my eyes to discover further qualities. It took time, and as time went on, there was an unfolding of the object in all its variety that I discovered. And as I looked, the light in my room changed, so the glints, reflections, and transparency of the bottle were altered too. This happened and could only happen in relation to me. As Edmund Husserl puts it, in perception, spatiality, and the body, the same unchanged form has a changing appearance according to its relation to my body. Deep concentration on space, light, color, and forms necessarily alienates things from their linguistic identities. Matter exists, of course, but has no intrinsic meaning, such as we attach to it. What my cursory attention gleans first, the figure of the bottle in front of my bookshelf, loses its importance as other qualities capture my eyes. After a while, the shifting light has changed the thing entirely, creating what is almost another object, certainly a visually different one. Morandi's still lifes, particularly his late works, the achievements of a master's eyes, seem to depict the experience of perceptual duration inside a single canvas. That is, his art appears to include the shifts of attention that reveal various qualities of a single thing or a group of things in the narrative of looking, including what was with what is. The bottle illuminated by the light of a minute ago isn't identical to the light on the bottle now, but the image can carry both. The painting can preserve the memory. And so Morandi creates ambiguity about both the where and the what in his images. There are many examples of this. When I first look at one of his pictures, I pick out objects against a background. I identify some things by name. My eyes see an object in front of another. But as I continue to look, I imagine that it has receded, or that what I identified as a thing may in fact be a shadow. Shapes begin to bleed into one another or appear to push against the object next to it, invading its space. There are deep shaded areas between objects that pull me in and separate them. And other times, I'm not sure where one ends and the other begins. A bottle starts to look as if it is teetering on top of another, or a box rests just at the horizon or table line, so the thing and line merge. It is as if different moments of perception over time have been remembered in the same image. Gottfried Böhm, in his essay Giorgio Morandi's Artistic Concept, refers to this as, quote, the pulsation of pictorial elements, and notes that despite this illusion of movement, a calm overall impression keeps reestablishing itself. This is undoubtedly true. My ambivalence about where or what doesn't create chaos or distress in me. Böhm discovers a paradoxical reality in these images. He writes, in his pictures, Morandi allows us to participate in a temporal order that is optimistic and immaterial at the core of its experience. The objects are as disembodied as they embody themselves. In the midst of fleeting time, the artist is able to create a place with solidity and presence. It is one half of the paradox, the sense of the immaterial and the disembodied, which has led me to speculate about transcendent meanings in Morandi. The experience of looking for a long time at one of his paintings can begin to feel as if one is looking at the representations of ghosts of things, not of things themselves. But then it is also true that the objects may reappear again as representations of matter. Those fluctuations are also vital to the curious emotional world of the pictures, which I am not at all sure can be characterized as optimistic. Here I part company with Böhm. All perception is accompanied by feeling, even if we sense a kind of neutrality or equilibrium about what we're looking at, what the neurologist Antonio Damasio calls background feelings that are always present in us as subjects. Good art necessarily has an emotional component. I'm the third person to say this. I was so happy to hear the other speakers say it too. And because emotion consolidates memory, this is now a neuroscience fact, it also helps us remember a work of art, take it with us in our minds, not an identical copy, but some version of it or recollection of the experience. Henry James said a beautiful thing. He said, in the arts, feeling is meaning. Morandi does not produce in me the emotional waves I feel when I look at Chardin, whose work has brought me near tears. This is funny because, of course, we heard that there was weeping for Morandi. So this just shows that subjective reality is there. It's important. The project is different, but like Chardin, the traces of the brush on the canvases or the stroke of a line in a drawing act on me emotionally, and no doubt are crucial to the dialectic of stillness and movement that in the end creates subtle alterations of mood. Hints of disturbance and imbalance are here, quivers, hoverings, and somber colors that evoke melancholy. Color falls into the pre-attentive visual scheme. Before we can even name a hue, we have felt it as a sensory reality in our bodies. Blue and green affect us differently from red and yellow. As Kim McLaren argues in an essay on embodied perception, quote, that the stimuli of short duration produce an effect in persons' bodies before a color is explicitly sensed, suggests that it is our sensitive, perceptual, motor body and not a knowing, thinking subject that senses colors. I'm sorry, all these people write that way. But that's, you know what she's saying? She's saying that the color gets us before we've had any conscious knowledge of it, really. It just goes straight into you. Color acts in us. And Morandi is a nuanced observer of color revealed by light and its essential instability. To feel Morandi, it's important to see the actual paintings and not look only at reproductions. And it is also, I think, vital to recreate to some degree the perceptual drama of the studio, to stand and look long and hard at a single picture and see what happens. Apparently, this is what Morandi himself did with his own works even after they were done. According to Janet Abramowitz, who knew the artist, after he had become famous and his pictures were in great demand, collectors had to wait for them. Once he had finished a painting, he did not let it go right away. Instead, she writes, he, quote, would hang it on a wall with others that explored the same theme and observe the sequential development of that particular series. At that time, he would often write the name of the future owner on the wooden stretchers of the finished painting, but the canvas would remain on Morandi's wall until he felt he had studied it sufficiently. He didn't alter the images. He meditated on them. Here I come again with this weeping stuff, but you will not weep, I say, when you look at these pictures. But some of you may. But I think you will be fascinated by the delineated spaces, the muted colors with the surprise of a yellow or blue, the openings and relations among apparent objects, the wobbles on a fluted form that act on the body like a tremor, solid blocks that begin to vanish into blur, houses that resemble blocks, boxes or blocks like houses, bottles like buildings, dense areas that might be things and might be space. And with continued study, all of this does take on a spiritual quality. Spiritual is a difficult word, I know, but I am not using it as a stand-in for the supernatural or God, although Morandi was a Catholic and did go to church. I am thinking of something far more common, which is that if I open myself fully and turn my whole attention onto these canvases for an extended period, if I shut out thoughts about what I'm going to have for dinner, or the book I was reading yesterday, or the fact that my shoes are pinching me, or the comments of fellow spectators, and give myself over to what I am seeing, there will be an accompanying feeling of strangeness and utter muteness, even transcendence, rather like what happens to people who meditate and speak of sensing their deep connections to things in the world, of an empty self and vanishing boundaries. Indeed, if you look long enough at a single object, you yourself, your I-ness, will vanish in the fullness of the image you are looking at. I am not proposing Morandi as Zen master, but rather suggesting that the pictures themselves partake of a psychology of vision that occurs when the ordinary semantic meanings we ascribe to things have not disappeared entirely, but have loosened their hold, and through an open, embracing vision of what appears, the ordinary acquires the attributes of the extraordinary. Morandi's images do not dissolve into total abstraction, although some of his late watercolors get very close. The artist's flat rejection of metaphysical realism, the idea that we can truly know the real world, is not the same as saying that we don't see the world, but rather that what we see is filtered through us. Subject and object are not so easily separated in this view. I think Morandi's insistence on the abstract character of the real is a way to say, this canvas is my perception, is my reality. It represents what I have actually seen. From this perspective, Morandi is not clinging to the figurative, but acknowledging that figure remains part of his understanding of what had been there for him in its fluctuating temporal reality, and which is now an immutable record or form of that experience. Abramowitz writes that in 1955, Morandi confessed to her that had he been born 20 years later, he would have been an abstract painter. We heard this earlier. Roditi pressed Morandi about abstraction and Mondrian in his interview, but Morandi refused to acknowledge any connection to the Dutchman or to his project. But then he was reluctant to be linked to any artist he didn't explicitly acknowledge as important to him, and actively tried to suppress a monograph that had been written about him by his friend, the art critic Arcangeli, because it placed his work in a historical perspective. Whatever the artist's speculations on his fate, had he been born later, I agree with what was said earlier. By 1955, abstraction had had a long history, and Morandi was deeply interested in what his fellow artists were up to all over the world. Had he wanted to cut all links to representation, he would have done it. My belief is that Morandi needed objects of scrutiny because the act of looking and painting, not just the act of painting alone, is the true subject matter of his work. When I draw a thing in front of me, I have always felt that it is as if I am touching it. My hand traces what I feel as its outline. I am not thinking about where my hand is moving. I am looking and rendering. The two acts aren't separate, but one and the same process. The work involves my whole attention. I don't narrate the process usually. It doesn't seem to need words in order to do it. Let us say I'm drawing the Perrier bottle. That bottle becomes paramount, completely absorbing. The sight of the bottle and my hand on the paper merge in a single action, and I lose myself. As Sean Gallagher and Dan Zahavi point out in their book, The Phenomenological Mind, this is a quote, "The body tries to stay out of the way so we can get on with our task. It tends to efface itself on its way to its intentional goal. We do not normally monitor our movements in an explicitly conscious manner, although we do have a pre-reflective awareness of our body in a very general terms. But this pre-reflective awareness is not very detailed. I can say that I'm reaching out to grasp a cup, but my sense of this is oriented toward the goal or intentional project I am involved in and not toward the specifics of my movement. I can't say very much about how I shape my hand in order to pick up a cup." End quote. This is because we have a proprioceptive sense of our bodies, a body schema which does not require explicit consciousness. If we had to think through every gesture, our lives would be a misery. Unlike reaching for a cup, art requires editing and thought as well. But finding the rightness one is looking for and knowing when to stop is a mysterious process and emerges from places in the mind that are often hidden. The result, the art we hang on the wall, becomes the tangible record of that dynamic, embodied experience of perceiving and making. "Nature is within us," said Cézanne. "We speak of inspiration," wrote Merleau-Ponty, and then went on, "and the word should be taken literally. There really is inspiration and expiration of being, action and passion, so slightly discernible that it becomes impossible to distinguish between what sees and what is seen, what paints and what is painted." Morandi's bottles, cups, boxes, coffee pots, saucers, and cloths, these cast-off objects, often asymmetrical and worn, became vehicles in the inspiration and expiration of being. The humbler, the blanker, the dustier, the more undistinguished the things, the better, because they offered themselves up to the eyes of the painter without context or assigned meanings. For it was the unknowable he knew he wanted to paint, that abstract, objective reality, which we have parsed and articulated for ourselves as cups and trees. When I visited the Morandi Museum in Bologna, I looked into the small space where the artist's studio has been reproduced and was seized by a terrible poignancy. The strangeness of the project became obvious. There was something withdrawn and retentive at the core of this bachelor's personality, and stubborn, too. He did what he did. I looked at his chair, his hat, and the jumble of pedestrian objects that he had carefully gathered and saved to paint. They looked so abandoned, so unremarkable, so irretrievably banal, that in that moment they summoned for me only the artist's death, the great gaping absence of the man whose being had enchanted them. Thanks a lot.